Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Krypto Labs. We welcome you all tonight for a special event on cryptocurrency, where our panel of experts will be discussing with us about cryptocurrencies, security, regulation, and unrealized potential. News of blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies are surging the scene with the promise to disrupt the financial and banking industry as we know it. Critics call it phantom money, while regulators fret over the anonymity of its transactions, and central banks advise against it. What is the future of cryptocurrencies? And can blockchain technology usher us into a new era of financial security and reduced transactional margins? We will find out tonight the implications of integrating cryptocurrency and the role governments have in playing to promote cryptocurrencies. But first, I'd like to give you an introduction about Krypto Labs. So Krypto Labs is a unique ecosystem for funding groundbreaking startups. Krypto Labs is the place where dreams become a reality. We are honored to have all of you present in our state-of-the-art innovation center. As some of you might know, we have had a first contest in Krypto Labs. In fact, we finished the first transaction a few days ago, investment transaction, and we have had around 2,000 applications from 75 different countries and 23 sectors for the first contest. The second contest is on innovation in drone technology, mainly because, in our opinion, drone technologies still has a lot of industries to disrupt. We received for this around 200 applications, and on May 6, we have the contest event. We also have an incubation program that launched, and we already are proud to say we have 200 applications, 200 global applications. If you think about the core of Krypto Labs' business model, it's incubation, mentorship, networking, and seed funding. And we are on our way to do all of this. We have also held a number of events here. This is one of them. We've also held a number of workshops, some of them by us and others by stakeholders within our ecosystem. We have almost 100 individuals every day coming here to work on various technological projects. With that, I would like to introduce to you the Master of Ceremony and moderator for tonight's event, Jean-Luc Scherer, founder and CEO of Innopolis.
Hello, good evening. Glad to have the honor to moderate the panel with our esteemed panelists. Tonight we will talk about cryptocurrencies, about regulation, security aspects, and we will try to have this panel as a bit of an interactive session. So we will divide it in 3 different blocks. A first block where we will do an introduction on cryptocurrencies, just to make sure that everybody understands a bit the differences between currencies, cryptocurrencies, and gets an idea of the potential cryptocurrencies have. The second part will be about the security aspects, scalability of the currencies, and the third part, and this is probably the part most interesting for startups, we will talk about ICOs. Now, in order to get everybody on the same page also, I'm doing a quick introduction for everybody to have some basic background data. So, first of all, I'd like to start a bit with a history of cryptocurrencies and history of Bitcoin in particular. It all started about 10 years ago, pretty much at the same time when we had big financial crisis and general population started to have a bit a bad feeling about banks, about central authorities managing our finances. So 2008, there was a white paper issued by Satoshi Nakamoto, which basically described the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network. And it took about 2 years until we had the first Bitcoin transaction, and somebody actually paid 10,000 Bitcoins for buying 2 pizzas, which would be today about $10 million, right, more or less. Took another year until we had the first rival currencies appear. So it took about 3 years until we had a number of cryptocurrencies out there on the market. The value of the Bitcoin also raised fairly quickly, up to $1,000 by 2013. And that's also when we started to have the cryptocurrencies being very visible and also becoming prone to attacks from hackers. In particular, we had the first major theft at the Mt. Gox exchange in Japan. And 2016 then, we had Ethereum and ICOs. Last year, Bitcoin passed the 10,000 US dollar mark. And basically, Bitcoin is now one of the, is the major cryptocurrency being used. And there's a number of alternative coins also being developed over the last couple of years. We can go to the next one. The interesting thing also is when we look at the cryptocurrency, actually we need to make a difference between Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, and the technology behind it. So the technology behind Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies is blockchain. And what that technology provides you is the ability to remove the trusted parties that you have in the middle today when you do transactions, business transactions, which can be banks or any other type of third party. And basically, the ledger that is normally owned by the central authority is distributed across a network of nodes. Now, the benefits of this is that this ledger that is distributed across the network is cryptographically secured. It's immutable, so basically it cannot be tampered with. It's transparent, auditable, so basically you can follow all kinds of history of transactions. Since you remove this kind of man in the middle, you also can simplify processes, you provide more efficiency, and through that you also do cost reductions by basically removing third-party fees. Now, when we had the introduction of technologies like Ethereum, we also have the introduction of smart contracts, which basically are contracts that can be executed automatically when a certain event happens. So this is the technology behind the cryptocurrencies. Now, there is a, if you can go to the next one, today there's a big buzz around cryptocurrencies, and there's also a big question mark on whether we are in a bubble, where we are in that bubble, and if we put the cryptocurrency in perspective with some of the other bubbles we had in history, like the Japan asset bubble was $26 trillion, US Great Recession, 8 trillion, dot-com bubble, 7 trillion, the cryptocurrency is still fairly small compared to that. So even though there's a lot of volatility today happening in the cryptocurrencies, where we are in this crypto bubble is still a bit of a question mark. All right. Now, all these transactions happening today with cryptocurrencies and also the volatility and some of the hacks and scams that have happened also led to a lot of governments taking very different views on the regulation of cryptocurrencies. Now, this was a report published by Thomson Reuters a few months ago, and what we can see here is that some countries like Japan have really endorsed the cryptocurrencies 100%, and some others like Bangladesh, for instance, they made it a criminal act to actually use the cryptocurrencies. And this is, if you look at the Middle East part, it's still a gray area, and this is the part of the discussions we will have here as well. But as you can see, the world is very much split on whether cryptocurrencies are a positive thing or not. So regulators are still very much split across the board. All right, next one. And the last thing, and this is also some data I want to share as a bit as background data. If we look at the amount of money that has been raised through ICOs. So ICO is basically a form of crowdfunding using blockchain technology. And that helps startups basically to raise money for their startups. And the amount of money raised last year, at the end of last year, was 4 times the amount of money raised by VCs. So we see startups see an opportunity really to use that mechanisms as a way to raise money. This is very quickly what I wanted to share, just a bit to give you some background data before starting our panel discussion. Now I'd like to invite on stage Dr. Nasser Saidi. Dr. Nasser is the president of Nasser Saidi Associates, former chief economist at the DIFC, and his business ranges with engagements from governments, central banks, regulatory agencies, and businesses, particularly in the banking, financial, and management consulting fields. Please welcome Dr. Nasser. Please, second. Then we have Mrs. Kokila Allah. She's a managing partner of Mahmoud Hussain Law Firm. She's advising clients in FinTech on correct jurisdictions to carry out proposed activities, assisting clients with funding rounds and implementing of blockchain technology, providing full legal support for initial coin offerings. Please welcome. And last but not least, Mo Adam is joining us from Canada. He's the founder of BitAccess, and BitAccess is leading the commercialization of digital currency technologies into customer-facing products, backed by Y Combinator as well as other Silicon Valley-based investors. BitAccess has brought several digital currency products to market in over 15 countries. Please welcome Mo. All right, so we'll jump into the first topic, and basically what we will do, we will go on for about 20 minutes, and then I will give the audience a chance to ask questions, and then we will move to the second topic. So I'd like to start by asking Dr. Saidi about, again, to set a bit the stage, what is the difference between cryptocurrency and what we would call a regular currency or a fiat currency?
Okay. I think that's a good question and a good way to start off. And let me explain that when I talk about this, I talk it from the point of view of an economist and a central banker and a regulator. So I'm not a techie. I like to understand as much as possible tech. I got involved into crowdfunding several years ago, but I'm not approaching it from a techie point of view. So let's start off by understanding what we mean by money and what are the functions of money. Economists talk about 3 major functions of money. First, it is a unit of account. That is, I can say that the value of this container is 50,000 dirham. So it's a unit of account. Second, it's a medium of exchange. That is, it allows us to exchange value among each other, because otherwise I'd be forced into a barter. I sell economics lessons, and you sell me bread. Well, you might not be interested in my economics lessons. You couldn't care less. What you really want is something else. So if we have an exchange, if we have a currency, it is a medium of exchange allowing each one of us to do what they want. Third item is that it's a store of value. That is, I can put my wealth into money, and it allows me to preserve that wealth over time. There's a fourth function, very important, which is it is considered to be legal tender, a legal tender. In other words, the government or a sovereign says that the money can be used to pay taxes or to pay debt. So those are four major functions. So when we're asking the question of a cryptocurrency, we always need to go back and say, does it serve those three functions? And the additional function may be of it being legal tender. Now, again, we need a bit of taxonomy, and it's important. There are four key aspects of cryptocurrencies, or of currencies. The first question you need to ask is, who is the issuer of the currency? Who is the issuer? Usually the issuer is a central bank, and the central bank usually has a monopoly in issuing it, given by the sovereign. Or it could be a private currency, privately issued currency. There was a period, for example, in the United States, which we called wildcat banking in the United States, where banks used to issue currencies. This was before the Federal Reserve was established. And because there was no central authority, the banks were issuing pieces of paper, and there was, in some cases, no limits. And the prices of the different pieces of paper issued by the different banks fluctuated. And it led to a crisis. So the first question you had to ask, who's the issuer? Second is, what is the form of the currency? Is it a physical currency? Is it paper? Is it gold? Is it silver? In some cases, for example, during the Second World War, in the prisoner of war camps, they didn't have money. So what they used as currency was cigarettes. They actually used cigarettes to exchange value among each other. So another question is it electronic or is it physical? Third question, how do you transfer this currency? Is it in a centralized fashion, i.e. by a central bank and banks, coming from a central bank and issued, or decentralized, that is, there is no central authority? And the fourth aspect is the question of accessibility. Is this currency universally accessible? Everybody can access it? Or is it limited in terms of accessibility? When you look at the cryptocurrencies we talk about today, there's three, therefore, aspects to them. One is they're electronic, they're purely electronic, there's nothing physical behind them. Number two, they are nobody's liability. When a central bank issues currency, it is the liability of the central bank and therefore the liability of the government. Today, when you have Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple, or other, it is nobody's liability. That's an important issue. And the third aspect, important, is that this is peer-to-peer. This is person-to-person, potentially business-to-business. So I think these taxonomies are very important. So I think during our discussion, I think it's going to be very important to ask the question. Currently, we have private currencies. If you look at Bitcoin, you look at Ripple, you look at all of those, these are really actual private currencies. I think it is more accurate to call them crypto assets as opposed to cryptocurrency, because we don't actually use them the way we use a currency.
So all right, so there's some fundamental differences between currencies and cryptocurrencies, and there's some of these requirements we could say are satisfied by the currencies, some others not. If I ask more, for instance, based on that, are there limitations in terms of the applications we can see in cryptocurrency, and let's say, what are typical good use cases or applications?
That's a great question, Jean-Luc. Thanks for asking. And I think that I would take a different vision of what cryptocurrency is than Nasser would, simply because I'm an engineer, and so I take it more from a perspective of physics than, say, economics. And I think that if we look at cryptocurrency more from a technological perspective, we might get different determinations of what it's useful for and what the potentials are.
Yeah.
And so in essence, when we look at the digitization of money, everybody has some digital money in some form. They have a credit card, they have a bank account. It's just a number and a database on some computer. What's different about cryptocurrency is that it is not centrally issued, as you had mentioned, but actually is that it is not double spendable. And I will talk about this really quickly because that touches on the really core opportunity with this technology. So when we go back to the internet and how maybe peer-to-peer networks emerged, they emerged for file sharing purposes. The original peer-to-peer networks were like a BitTorrent, which is actually very similar to what Bitcoin is. And what file sharing proved to us was that there were no digital assets. If I created an MP3 file, I could send it to Nasser, and he could send it to any number of other people at zero cost. There's zero marginal cost to sending an MP3 file. And therefore, that MP3 file had zero value in essence. What's different about Bitcoin is that this file that I have downloaded can only be sent to one other person. It is a crypto asset, as you had mentioned, and therefore it is scarce. All it is we have created something called digital scarcity. And that is the fundamental technological revolution that we have created with this new technology, digital scarcity. And now, to actually think about all the opportunities that arise from digital scarcity is very challenging because it's virtually unlimited. But what I would say is that a lot of people are taking cryptocurrency and crypto assets and trying to put them in these boxes that we already have today that define the current economic system. And I think that we will see traditionally that has not worked very well. So for example, when we looked at the original internet, I don't know if many people would have thought that email was going to be the killer application, that SMTP and sending emails was going to be the big thing that everybody in the world was going to do. And so when we look at the opportunity, we should just make sure that we allow rampant, unhinged innovation in the space. Anybody who has an idea on how they can take digital scarcity and turn it into a new product or technology, they should go for it. Because it's going to be almost impossible for us to predict really what that next killer app is going to be.
I think that's...
If I may.
Can we quickly intervene at this stage?
all right.
Okay. I think you have to be very careful about the hype. Yeah? We need to distinguish between blockchain, and we know what the potential applications of blockchain are, and so-called cryptocurrencies. Okay? When we go back to the issue of the internet, and you wanted to use the analogy to do that, the internet developed us, gave us email, gave us the World Wide Web, gave us digital commerce and the digital economy. So far, from cryptocurrencies, which I call crypto assets rather than cryptocurrencies, and from blockchain, I have nothing useful. For the rest, I know exactly what I got. For this, I don't have anything yet. I can think of many applications of blockchain, and I hope we can discuss them, but let's keep those separate from the crypto assets.
All right.
So if I may add, so if you look at, with all due respect, with the evolution of money, as you said, that has the three main elements, four, as you specified. And if you look at it, the history, so before we had the barter system, then money came with the stored value in it. So it was based on gold. Then we moved to debt. So we moved to the political system from pure asset-based. And now we're at an economy which is maths-based. So it's a part of evolution, and it's but natural. And as we talk about the hype, I think every new technology, as you're aware, that comes up, has its own hype. So we're at the stage of cryptocurrencies or the tokens that are issued where the hype is necessary for it to take its normal course and frizzle out and be the technology of not the future but of the present. Yeah. You know, as a lawyer, we see that when we are talking about driverless cars, when we're talking about artificial intelligence in robotics, in the robots who are coming up with emotional intelligence, we need to be ready to see that it will have its ups and downs, and if we go through it, and then we'll have discussions like this to come out with a proper regulatory framework, if I may use the big words like regulations coming in, setting in, and taking a part of it.
Right. So, from if I summarize from the three of you, we have underlying technology that has some value in itself, through the scarcities that it provides. Question is whether on top of that, the currencies that are built actually can satisfy the requirements, especially when we look at things like store of value or store of or a capability to do exchange with all the kind of volatility we see today. In the current format, there's a lot of questions that people have about how this should be regulated, and that's a topic I'd like to get into now. And maybe I'll start with you, Kokali, on the...
So on the regulation side of it, if you see the governments across the world, as you showed it in the Reuters report,
Yeah.
the regulators have different approach to it. So some regulators are pro it. We say, oh, this regulator in this country is pro it, like we have Dubai looking at it, UAE looking at it in a more progressive way and accepting that this is the new technology. Cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology is the way forward. And then we need to go back to our legislations, our regulators, and see how do we match up to the new technology that is coming up. So it is like how we said the boom of internet. When it started, people said, oh, it's going to crash, it's a bubble, it's not going to go ahead. But then today we are in a world where we cannot think of a world without internet. So the regulators have realized it. Many regulators, like we have the Abu Dhabi Global Market in UAE, coming up with their friendly papers and guidelines on, as it's a new technology, we have more and more guidelines coming every day which are being revisited, keeping in pace with the technology, the new currencies, the new software that is coming up. So the regulators have taken an approach. Some are sitting on the fence and saying, we'll wait and watch what happens. Some regulators have gone ahead very aggressively and said, we do not believe in it, we ban you from using it. Some have said that this is the way forward. So it's quite an interesting time for all of us. And when we advise our clients who come to us for crowdfunding or raising an ICO, we look at the different jurisdictions around the world and see what the regulators' approach has been. But the risk element, yes, is very high. It is a volatile, there is a lot of hype, but it will all fizzle out.
Yeah, I'd like to draw a parallel. You mentioned the internet and the time it took. But the internet was, a lot of it was very soon and quickly driven by community. So basically there was agreement, I would say, and de facto standards. Now, is there a risk that we see fragmentation and then basically see islands of regulations, and that basically that will then impact the progress?
So when we talk about a peer-to-peer network, we're talking about establishing a trust. So when you explained how a blockchain technology works, you mentioned the fact that there used to be, or there is still a third party, trusted third party, which says that if you have an IOU, a dollar bill, there is a central bank saying that this is your IOU, this is your promissory note, this is the currency that you have. This peer-to-peer technology talks about establishing that trust between two people who are doing the business.
Right.
So I don't need a third party to say, oh, you trust him. I have a technology which cannot be tampered and which has the evidence and the proof attached to it, saying that there is the trust element already established. And when we do look at the smart contracts, the e-contracts, all the regulatory and jurisdictional aspects are covered in it. That's why we as lawyers feel that we need to be at par and move at a faster pace as the technology is moving. Right. So the regulators across the world will have to open up to it, and they'll have, in my opinion, personal opinion, have no other option but
right.
to accept it.
Do you want to add something on
I'd
the
like
US and Canada?
Yeah, I'd like to add. So we have customers in about 15 countries, principally Europe and North America. So we've had a pretty good exposure to the regulatory frameworks in all these countries. And so the first thing to know when you look at regulations with cryptocurrency is that there's virtually no way to technically implement a regulation on these currency networks, simply because they run on the internet and through encrypted protocols. And so for a government to say ban cryptocurrency isn't actually feasible. And so that's the first thing that we should know about regulations, that just because a regulation is passed doesn't mean it's enforceable. And the second thing is that it's very difficult to put cryptocurrency into a box that has fit for other types of currencies or assets, simply because it acts both as a currency in certain situations and proof of ownership in other situations. And so the regulations are very challenging. So for example, in Canada, we had some reasonably clear regulation on cryptocurrency as a payment system, meaning you had to pass money transmission laws, you had to know your customer, you had to do a whole bunch of things that are relevant to payment services. But that doesn't mean that those regulations apply to securities. So for example, if somebody was issuing a security on one of these networks, meaning a stock or a bond or any type of other digital representation of a security, that regulation no longer really means anything. And so when you're regulating these things, you actually kind of have to regulate them as this beast that has two forms. It can be a payment, it can be a security, it can be many different things. And so I think that the governments that have been the most successful at fostering the innovation have tried to not necessarily take cryptocurrency and put it under a current regulatory regime, but have just said, listen, this is something very new, and we're going to put it in a new box. And that's likely the best way to foster its innovation.
Can we just jump in at this stage?
Go ahead.
What countries and regulators worry about is precisely this issue of pseudo-anonymity, right, or anonymity, because it can be open to money laundering, it can be open to the financing of terrorism, it can be open to be used by all sorts of criminal activities, drugs and all the rest. It can be used for tax evasion. It can be used for escaping capital controls. So if you take a country like China, what they got worried about is two things. They found out that maybe 50 to 60% of the mining was being done in China, but also people were starting to use the cryptocurrencies to evade capital controls and getting rid of renminbi by escaping through a cryptocurrency. So at the moment, regulators still don't have a standard, but it is being discussed by the Fed, by the ECB, by the G20. All countries are going to move towards regulation of cryptocurrencies. So expect that to happen maybe later on in 2018. But more important, I think, the issue of regulation is going to be linked to when central banks are going to issue their cryptocurrencies. So I think the main area of competition in 2018, 2019 is when are central banks going to be issuing their cryptocurrency, because then they can regulate it. You're absolutely right. At the moment, it's very difficult to regulate something which is on the web.
Just to maybe expand a bit on the regulatory part, which are the aspects that need to be regulated just for us to get that wider picture? Because we mentioned now money laundering laws, tax evasion and so on. Earlier you mentioned, we talked about accountability. Are there other aspects that typically we need to take into account that,
well, there's the issue, I mean, from a regulatory point of view, regulators worry about the investors and the safety of the investors going in. So when we have regulations for investment in securities, what we care about is what's happening to the citizens or the investors' wealth. Here, there is nobody that can guarantee or protect the wealth that goes into those crypto assets. if tomorrow, for example, an exchange goes broke, or a company which has just done an ICO goes broke, there is nobody behind it. So from a legal point of view, if it goes into bankruptcy, what are my rights as an investor or as a holder of a token or a security? And who protects me from that?
Sure. So these are the discussions which are happening globally in all judicial and legislation systems, that how do we talk about a protection to be given to, there are two folds. These are the people who are launching the ICOs and as well as the investors. They both need the legal protection, and that's where the legislations are being worked on. Having said that, we believe in, when we first went to law school, the first thing that they taught us was that when you deal with your clients, you need to tell them ignorance is no excuse. So there's a phrase we use, caveat emptor, which means buyer beware. So if you read some of the, as we were discussing, some of the white papers of the SAFT agreements that are drafted for these currencies,
right,
they give you in details that where your money is being invested or put in.
Right.
So today, to say that a company's gone rogue, when you look at the very inception, and most of them, especially in Northern America, have gone through that test, where you look at it, that right from the inception, the intention and the framework and the ecosystem in which this whole ICO was being done, or the investors were asked to fund it, was not correct. And the whole self-regulation aspect of it was not there in place. So at current position, this is what we need to rely on. We're coming up with different arbitration or mediation centers which are looking at resolving these disputes online. When we draft these agreements, we try to see, and when we sit with our clients, to understand the accountability and the liability go hand in hand. So at this stage, this is an evolving space where we are working as lawyers to see how best we can make the people who are launching these currencies liable for what they are going to go ahead with.
Do you, maybe a question back to Mo to conclude that round, and that is, how is the startup community reacting to this? Because I think there's also developments on that side. I mean, all these people working with ICOs and developing currencies, they're aware of these challenges, and some of them are reacting and backing up their currencies as well, right?
Yeah, well, I would say this. The startup community is always going to be entrepreneurial, and they'll always be hustlers, which means that they will always find a way to do what they want to do. And so that means if there's any jurisdiction that allows them to do an ICO in the way that they would like to, these entrepreneurs will go there and do it. And so the challenge for a lot of countries right now is implementing regulations without kicking out the startups that may or may not be successful. And so I would think that Ethereum is a very good example of this. Ethereum was a project that was started by a group of entrepreneurs in Toronto, Ontario, at the end of 2013, start of 2014. But they actually did their ICO as a foundation in Switzerland. And the reason for this is they weren't able to get very clear indications from their local regulators on whether or not they could perform this ICO in the way they wished. Now, they didn't get very clear indications from Switzerland either, but it was better. And so they went there and they did it. And it has been a wildly successful ICO. But for every Ethereum, there's going to be hundreds of very bad ICOs. Yes. And so to touch on your question about where's the startup community going with this, startups are always going to be hustlers. And so they're always going to go to the best place for what they need to do. And so from the regulatory standpoint, it's always going to be a balance of keeping good talent in your jurisdiction versus, the laws that you currently have in place and you're obligated to enforce.
All right.
Okay, just on this one, because I think it's important. We need to distinguish between FinTech and the cryptocurrencies and crypto assets. I'm a strong advocate of FinTech, which includes crowdfunding. Okay? So when we think about crowdfunding for startups, young companies, and all the rest, we can think of how they can get finance, either through equity, through debt, or through donations. And we know how to do that, okay? When, however, somebody does an ICO, I am no longer sure what I'm buying. With the crowdfunding, There are the risks, but then people are warned. Caveat emptor. With the ICO, it is very vague and is very opaque. But we might come back to that.
We will develop that topic more in the last block. Maybe the very last question for this first block is talking about potential with cryptocurrency. Now we see there's a difference between what's being done by startups, individuals, and the drive by governments to develop their own currencies and banks and so on. Now, last December, UAE announced some agreement or collaboration with Saudi Arabia. Can you explain, one of you, the objectives with that agreement that was set to test, to collaborate for a cryptocurrency?
Well, maybe others will comment. There's a number of governments right now that are considering issuing their own currency.
Yes.
There's an e-krona in Sweden wanting potentially issued. The Estonians, who are at the forefront in terms of anything digital and can provide you with an e-residency, an e-company and all the rest, are considering est coins, so that they'll issue their own currency. The Singaporeans are thinking of having theirs. The EU, I think, is going to be very late in doing so. What happened is that SAMA and the UAE Central Bank agreed to work together on potentially a currency, a digital currency, that can be used for cross-border transactions.
Yes.
Between them. This might be a bit easier than getting it accepted outside the two countries.
All right. Now we will take a few questions before moving to the next block. If we have a mic. Do you have any questions about that first part?
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. My experience is banking, and I consider myself a finance person, although once upon a time I was an engineer, but I deserted this industry for many different reasons. However, you know, as someone in the financial services industry, I do not think that this industry and the regulators and governments can ignore or set aside the fact that cryptocurrencies and the technology behind them, as you have rightly mentioned, which is blockchain, is going to go anywhere else. There are lots of analogies of what is happening today with cryptocurrencies that has happened, for example, in the internet bubble. That's one thing. The other thing is the hustling that startups do. You know, if you look at Uber, they've broken every single rule, and they have become so big that they cannot be ignored, and they forced governments to negotiate with them. Now, my question is on the last part that was discussed, which is countries and governments and regulators coming up with cryptocurrencies either jointly or separately. This really defeats the whole purpose of cryptocurrencies, which is really the independence of that method of exchange. So my first question is, does it really make a difference to the current currencies if they come up with a cryptocurrency? And the second question is, do regulators fathom the extent of cryptocurrencies being so widely available to a lot of people that they can eventually disregard regulators? So for example, if today 2 billion people are using between themselves bitcoins, they really don't need the regulators. So do you think that regulators are aware of the extent of this situation and what it could mean to the concept of currency and economy in the world? Thank you.
Very good question.
Sure. I think it's very important to distinguish again the use of blockchain technology, where I fully agree. The use of blockchain technology is going to lead to a lot of disintermediation in the financial sector, whether it's commercial banks, whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's asset and wealth management. So I can see the applications of blockchain, which will mean that it will be highly disruptive for financial services. If I can have a peer-to-peer transaction, why do I need to go through a deposit at a bank? I don't need the banks. I could also say that if a central bank issues a currency, a cryptocurrency, I can also use that for peer-to-peer. Currently today, central banks could open accounts for all of us. They don't do that because there's a weight of history and institutions. But in the future, in a purely digital world, they could do so. And if they do issue a digital currency, this will be highly disruptive. So I agree with you, it will be highly disruptive to the banking system, also highly disruptive to the central banks themselves. The main issue that you have to face is that we live in sovereign states which have their own laws and regulations, and that if there's something that goes wrong, somebody has to intervene. And in a purely digital world, if something goes wrong, it's not clear who is going to intervene and who's going to protect your rights as an investor or as a consumer.
Can I touch on that one as well? So I think that you make a great point about what is the point of a central bank's currency, and I would tend to disagree with Nasser a little bit in that I would predict that if the central bank were to issue a cryptocurrency, its number one use would be to buy.
Sorry, don't quote me that. I said no need for central banks.
Yeah, I didn't say there's no need, but I think that if a central bank were to issue a cryptocurrency, say tomorrow, I would predict the number one use would be to buy other cryptocurrencies with it. Because people don't necessarily want what they already have. They want something new and exciting. But I can say I work very closely with the Canadian government right now to digitize and bring a lot of their services onto the blockchain. And they very much see this as a competition. I don't think that it's easy to say that governments around the world are sitting back and ignoring this. This is very much a competition to government. This is a decentralized network, and it is conceivable that if 2 billion people were using Bitcoin, they wouldn't need to pay taxes or do a whole bunch of other things that they currently do with the government. And so I think that smart governments will see this as a competitive threat, and they will build services that are competitive with these new networks. And just issuing a central bank currency isn't going to do that. It's going to have to be a whole lot more.
Yeah.
I see this as a PPP, a public-private partnership, where the central banks have realized, as you said, that it is a competition and they need to come up with their own currencies. And more welcoming thought from the central banks to be proactive and go in it. And that's how the other currencies which are not doing so well or do not have a strong foundation or a strong base will fizzle out, and we will have the real currencies which should remain in the market. So when you have somebody as aggressive as a central bank of a country looking at it to use it for their own personal gain, for looking at putting the taxation aspect to it and making money there. So it is going in the right direction. So, and competition is always good.
Right.
Thank you for the interesting session. So my question is, if I was in Amazon, okay, what does it take for Amazon to use a cryptocurrency? So none of them is, the big players, none of them are, but will they? And if they do, what does it take?
I'll touch on that. So, in all honesty, Amazon could very quickly use any cryptocurrency, but they wouldn't, and for very good reasons. It doesn't solve any of their problems. Amazon uses credit cards or other payment methods all over the world, and it works quite well. And they have done very good at making it very simple for the user. And so I don't think that we should just look at cryptocurrency as a payment currency for what exists today. We have to think of this as something new, and there will be new economic activity that will exist, and that cryptocurrency will be used for that new economic activity. And so it might not be that Amazon will use cryptocurrency. But maybe the next big Amazon will be built on one of these networks,
Yes.
or one of the next big casinos will be built on one of these networks. But there's no real problem that Bitcoin or any of these cryptocurrency solves that Amazon has today. Maybe from a marketplace perspective. And so if you think about eBay and PayPal, when eBay started, it didn't really flourish until there was PayPal, an easy way to pay online. And interestingly enough, for Bitcoin, I was in this industry back in 2011. One of the main uses for Bitcoin was to buy drugs on the internet. Like, I'll say it openly. That's what people used Bitcoin for. And this was done on the dark web. And Bitcoin solved a problem for these people on the dark web. Now, we're not proud of that, and we're happy that it's dying down now. But we should always think about cryptocurrency is going to solve problems for people who have these problems. It's not some magic new currency that's going to make e-commerce better for Google or Amazon.
What we're saying is that there has to be a very good use case that solves a dear problem to an industry or a company.
So
I would say if we want to disintermediate Amazon entirely, so if we want to say, Amazon connects buyers and sellers all over the world. One of Amazon's biggest things is actually not selling products itself, but third-party sellers sell products on Amazon. That's their biggest business. If these third-party sellers had a decentralized platform where they could sell directly to the consumer without giving a cut to Amazon, maybe that network would flourish. Would it work on a blockchain? I don't know. It hasn't been built today. But that's the way I see it evolving much more.
Again, I think there's a matter of perspective. I visit China very frequently. And when I think of where the digital economy is going and where AI is going, I look at China, not the US or even Europe. So if today you're using WeChat, I want to come back to this issue of networks and how important they are. If you use WeChat today, you can use it to chat, you can use it to order goods, you can use it to invest, you can use it to crowdfund, all in one application. The power of that is enormous because they have maybe some 800 million users per day. And so the power of using AI in this network where everybody is linked up are the true benefits, really, of what we call the digital economy. The issue of payments is a secondary issue. The value of the network itself is much greater than what you end up using the payment for.
we'll move on.
Good evening. You mentioned about digital scarcity earlier, and from an economics point of view, something that's scarce should store its value. But if you look at cryptocurrencies last year, they were very volatile. Okay, so that said, its store of value is questionable already. And I'll have to agree with Dr. Nasser about regulation coming in place. And if central banks around the world do introduce their own cryptocurrencies, what's the future of those crypto assets, as Dr. Nasser called them? Do you think they'll be still around?
I think that's a question for me.
I guess so.
I would say that you first have to postulate what's the reason for a central bank to issue a cryptocurrency. If it's just to compete with a private payment network like Visa or MasterCard or any other, I don't know if maybe it'll be successful, maybe it won't be, but you're looking at it in a different way. Cryptocurrency is a technology, it's very volatile, and you're right, it doesn't store its value very well, and that's because most people are using it as a gambling mechanism. They treat it like a slot machine, and so it will be very volatile. But I think that we should remember this is a speculative market, and so if you believe that it has no value, then don't buy it. Oh, you're an investor, but that's good. But what I'm saying is the central bank cryptocurrency solves none of the problems that cryptocurrencies have solved. In that it is self-sovereign, it can't be seized, you own it yourself, and it has a fluctuative value. People like that, people like me who got into this industry in 2011 are very happy that it has a fluctuative value and it's not pegged to the central dollar.
To continue on your question, if a central bank issues a cryptocurrency, look at Sweden today. Swedes use very little cash, very, very little, maybe 5% of the transactions. So they're going to go towards an e-krona, probably going to be issued by the central bank. What that will do is it'll make all transactions faster, easier, but also people will trust the fact that there's a central bank issuing it. It'll be less volatile. If something goes wrong, I can go back to the central bank and the sovereign behind it. And I know there is trust because it's been established over a long period of time. So the real question behind any currency at the end of the day and any means of payment at the end of the day is trust and confidence in the institution behind it. I know these are still very early days, but when you talk about those crypto assets that we currently have, where is the trust being built? We were told, for example, when the Bitcoin paper first came out, that there will only be 21 million Bitcoins issued, right? Then we discovered in 2017, oh, I'm going to have a fork, then one fork and another fork, and now I have 3 Bitcoins, right? This, to an economist, is exactly what we call debasing the currency. In the past, when it was gold and silver, you shaved off a little bit of the gold. And what you're doing now is you're really saying at the end of the day, there is no limit. Whereas with a currency and money supply, a central bank has to follow a monetary rule. Here, it's not clear what the rule is any longer, I would argue.
Right. Let's move into the next block of the...
Sorry, just if you don't mind, just a quick, very interesting discussion. Yeah. So I think I'll take the side of Dr. Nasser and question to Mo. If cryptocurrencies are so great in payment processing, et cetera, and I'm not really updated with the latest in terms of transaction times, what I know is that they take a lot of time to do transactions, much slower than other forms. So do you think this is going to be a threat to the infiltration of cryptocurrency transactions in payments?
So I'd say that we're in the dial-up era of cryptocurrency right now. But just recently, new networks have emerged that are much faster. And so, for example, I don't want to get too technical, but on the Bitcoin network, we now have something called lightning payments that are instant and free. And so if the criticism of these cryptocurrency networks is that they are slow or clunky, I think that you should remember that these are the best software developers in the world who are working on this. And so I think that those are the things that we will be able to fix the easiest. The more difficult problems we have to solve are the ones you brought up of who's issuing this, what's the regulation, like what happens when somebody gets hacked. But I don't think that it's going to be a slow problem. I've already done Lightning transactions myself, and they're instant and fast. And so those are easy problems to solve, in my opinion.
Maybe I'd like to go back to that particular point and formulate it a bit differently. Today, there's a lot of talk about Bitcoin on one side, Ethereum on the other side. But who knows? I mean, in a year, in 2 years, we might have something else completely swiping away these technologies and replacing it. Is there a risk for that? Because let's say the idea of the cryptocurrency and what it can be used for and so on is very clear. We know there's technical limitations, but there's a lot of people working to trying to fix these things, right?
Yeah, I'd say definitely. I think that the chart you showed earlier, where it showed something like $700 million invested in ICOs, while not all of that will get efficiently allocated, a lot of that is going to get allocated to hiring the best engineers in the world to solve very difficult decentralization problems. And it's happening right now, and we can see it. And so when Ethereum was first postulated, people said it was impossible. And even I thought it was impossible. And here we are today. We have this network that's processing hundreds of thousands of transactions a day. And so I would keep in mind that you take a lot of really good engineers and you put them on a problem, and typically they will solve it. And so it's not always going to be linear. It's not always going to be predictable. But I believe that we have evidence now that these networks are scaling, maybe not to Visa scale today, but we're on a really great path.
All right.
since you mentioned Visa, I think it's good to talk about it. If you look at the average number of transactions done by Bitcoin today, you're talking maybe about 5 transactions per second, just about. They say the range between 4 to 7, let's say 5. Visa, just Visa alone, does something like 47,000 transactions per second, right? 47,000 transactions per second. So when we're talking about efficiency, yeah, we need to compare the efficiency of doing something through a Bitcoin versus the efficiency of doing it through payment systems which are really tried and tested. And they have not failed. If you look at one of the best tests, you look at the crash, yeah, 2008 crash. You look at terrorist attacks, okay? The payment system was the most resilient of those. We know how that works. We know what the safeguards are. I'm not sure what the safeguards are for Bitcoin, is my issue. And then I think we need to talk about the environmental costs,
Right.
and the energy costs.
Right. I think if we look at the point I was trying to make earlier is exactly this about the emerging technologies on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. There's already people working on, and I've seen white papers where basically people are able to go to much higher transaction per second rates. So this is going to be fixed. I don't think this is really, let's say, going to be a challenge in the future. But some of the other things are quite frightening when we talk about, going back to what we said about accountability. I just want to name some of the top hacks we have seen over the last couple of years. I think the first one was 2014. Almost $500 million lost in the Mt. Gox robbery. 2016, first one on Ethereum, the DAO hack, $50 million lost. 2016, Bitfinex hacks, 70 million lost. 2017, nice hash hack, 80 million. And earlier this year in January, CoinCheck, 500 million. So
The total is 1.2 billion.
yeah, and I think about when we look at ICOs, about 10% of the money raised has been stolen. What do we do about this? I mean, this seems to be the Wild West of it when we look at it from that perspective and from a kind of a security perspective.
I think, no, this is still a new technology. So just to be on the positive side. So this is still a new technology. There's the issue of hacking. But for me as an economist, there are 2 other issues which are important. One is the issue of market manipulation. Market manipulation. How? Because something like 60 to 70% of the mining takes place, or more actually, in 2 countries, right? Iceland and China. Yeah? And the reason why they're done in Iceland and China is because of the very cheap energy. But what it means is that there is a great deal of potential manipulation of the supply side. There is also potential manipulation on the demand side because of the ownership of the cryptocurrencies themselves.
Right.
Being in a limited number of investors or originally miners. I think we need to address that. The issue of market manipulation.
I agree, but I didn't get an answer to my question actually, and the question I have really with all these hacks is that do you have enough transparency? Do you have enough auditing done on all these systems that are actually transacting a huge amount of money?
I think this is where all the regulators are currently working in the world, and also the legislations are being revisited to look at the issues. So when a new technology, as we said, that we're still in the very early years of it. So when we see these problems, it's working in the reverse. We're looking at what we need to amend in our legislations So we may not regulate the entire cryptocurrency, but what segments of it need to be regulated, need to be bring in a proper judicial system. And when we're talking about disputes that may arise, today we're just looking at the crimes that are happening, but tomorrow we are looking at huge disputes that will be coming in this arena.
Okay, let me reformulate the question maybe a little bit. I worked in the telecoms industry, and I mean, our systems had to go through all kinds of tests. When you look actually at the details of the vulnerabilities of the hacks, it doesn't. Most of these don't pass basic, security checklists. And this is really, I mean, this is, for me, it's a bit frightening. Like one of the hacks, it was, they didn't even have a proper version handling of the system. So are we doing anything, or do you think that regulation should be addressing these points as well? Are they addressing them?
I think it's a free market.
Yes.
And so in a free market, you're going to have good companies with great policies, and you're going to have bad companies with bad policies. And it's going to be up to the market to decide who lives and dies. And unfortunately, I lost some money in the hacks that you listed, and I'm very unhappy about it. But there's two ways to look at it. You can look at it as a fundamental flaw in the system, which it wasn't. It was flaws in implementation. And you can also look at it as an interesting bug bounty program. So if there are problems in the system, there's a lot of incentive to find them. And it's good that we find them now when we have a very small market cap globally versus in, say, 10 years when there's real commerce moving through these systems. And so I think you're going to see these hacks continue to happen. And I don't think that any number of regulations is really going to fix it. It's a free market. Anybody can start a crypto company right now. And unfortunately, it's going to be up to the consumer to make sure that they put their money with a trusted company.
All right. Okay. Going back to the market manipulation then, I mean, I'll let you expand a bit on that part. I read also that about 60% of mining is controlled by about 6 companies.
That's right.
That's a bit scary, right? What should we do about this? Can we do anything about it?
The numbers, I mean, let's look at some of the numbers. 60% by 6 companies. These are the numbers which are discussed. The top 100 Bitcoin addresses control about 18% of the issued currency. With Ether, the top 100 addresses control 40% of the supply. Okay. For the other smaller ones, the top holders control more than 90% of it. So the risk, of course, is that some of the big holders can manipulate the market. And we're also told that something like 30% of the Bitcoin owners have lost the ability to access their Bitcoins. They don't know. They don't know where they can no longer access their wallets. They don't know how to get to their wealth. So that means that a small number can manipulate the market. We saw that with Mt. Gox. And if anybody's interested in that, there's a nice paper in the Journal of Monetary Economics on the Mt. Gox, which shows that it was one trader that drove up the price over the period of less than a few months. And then Mt. Gox exchange crashed. So this issue of market manipulation, I think, is a major issue. And it's not clear how we address it because you don't really have access to the numbers, and the regulators and even governments don't have access to what underlies.
All right. One last part about the kind of the scalability and security aspects. We touched on it a little bit earlier. Is the cost of the transactions today? You wanted to mention something about the electricity cost and carbon footprint.
Yes.
How, and then I'd like to hear a bit about the ways we're getting around this, going forward. What are the new technology developments to actually fix these issues. So
Sure.
currently it's very...
Here are some numbers, apparently verifiable numbers. So if you look at Bitcoin's current estimated total annual electricity consumption, it's about 58 terawatts. 58 terawatts. So typically on a given day, your Bitcoin uses more electricity than Singapore or Ireland, okay? More electricity than either Singapore or Ireland just to do the mining and the transactions, okay? The electricity consumed per transaction is 873 kilowatt hours per transaction. If you look at the carbon footprint, it's 428 kilograms of CO2 per transaction, okay? So for me, when I care who cares about the environment, I think we should have a carbon tax because they're using a lot of electricity and fossil fuels. And therefore, you either ban them, which I'm not in favor of. I think that we need to see the technology moving, but maybe we should be imposing a carbon tax. Yeah? These are horrendous numbers when you think of how much energy is being used for something which is not socially useful and which doesn't produce anything.
So I'd love to retort that just a little bit. So I agree that to the outside observer, it does look a little ridiculous to waste this energy. But we have to remember that this is a network that is cryptographically secured by this energy. And so in one sense, you could say we're wasting all of this electricity. But in another sense, we are also saying if you wanted to attack this network, you would need more energy than Ireland. And so then it becomes a question of how can you attack our network? We have designed an incredibly resilient network that is incredibly resilient to attack, and no nation state has yet successfully attacked it. And so while it may not be efficient to use energy in this way, this is the security model we have designed. If you want to hurt Bitcoin, you have to be ready to spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of energy to do it. And it has proven to be incredibly resilient. And so there are new technologies being developed. So for example, proof of stake, which use different mechanisms to mine these cryptocurrencies that don't use energy. And I hope that the innovation in this realm improves. But I would say that, listen, there's a huge trend towards renewable energies. And this is a free market. If people want to waste their energy on this, you're going to have to let them. If you implement a carbon tax, it won't stop us from mining. It'll just make it more expensive to mine. But we're going to keep on doing it.
Very good.
Yeah, but at the same, by the same token, I could be providing electricity to all of Africa instead of doing the Bitcoin mining. Now you could say that that is a market issue. That's true, but all markets, you were talking about telecoms, health, education, you name it, any market always lives within laws and regulations at the end of the day. So this is why we need to think very deeply about how much energy gets used, because there are wider issues affecting all of us through climate change and the impact on the environment.
Okay. I think we'll go into the third block now. We covered a lot of the challenges and issues here. So the potential with ICOs, and maybe you can start for the audience to, maybe we should start explaining a bit what an ICO is and why it's interesting, and then we'll take it from there.
So ICO, for basic understanding, stands for initial coin offering. So when initially we had companies going and seeking funding from the investors, they used to come up with, or they still come up with IPOs, initial public offer. Now we say it's an initial coin offering, which is normally majoritarily used by startups, where they need to go and raise fund as a crowdfunding. So instead of going to an angel investor or a VC, you have now today an option to go and raise funds globally. across the world based on any technology or any process that you have currently with you. Now, ICOs can be again broken down into majoritively two types of ICOs. One is based on a utility token, we call it a utility ICO, or there is a security-backed asset. The security-backed is an easier to deal with. It's almost like what an IPO would be like, where you have a current asset or a security of the company, and it's more like giving out the dividends to the shareholders who invest in this company. So the framework is pretty much the same. The regulators across the world are a lot keen to regularize and license the security-based tokens in ICOs. Then comes the utility tokens, which we see interestingly used by startups. And there are a lot of hustlers and the fly-by-night ICOs that come up, because this is the section which is not been regulated anywhere, in which the utility token in this, the company that is raising the fund and company which is actually going to do the operations, mostly do not have a link. And that's where we come in to bring up the self-regulations to make these ICOs more accountable and more successful, looking at the jurisdictions, setting them up from the jurisdictions where legally we can secure the investors who invest in it. And again, it goes back to the basic frameworks. Most of these ICOs have, like in your IPOs, you have a prospectus. In ICOs, we have a white paper, which talks about that if you're investing in this, what are the liabilities, what are the responsibilities, what are the risks, which is the jurisdiction in which the company that is launching, the history of the company, the technology or the process in which the money would be used, and the details of the promoters and the credibility of the promoters is mentioned.
Right. Okay, so a question to any of you actually is the, if you look at utility tokens, why would I buy into an ICO? I don't get dividends, I don't own anything. When does it make sense basically for a startup to build a utility token, and when does it make sense for me actually to buy into this?
So if I look at it from an investor's perspective, you buy into a utility token, we always advise our clients is that when you have the surplus money, to invest in a utility token, because there are no guarantees. As soon as I add the word guarantees or dividends, then it falls under the definition of a security token. And since we're saying that this is a very speculative, or the volatility of the cryptocurrencies is more associated to the utility tokens that are being launched, and worldwide these are launched, and that is where the most of the regulators are currently working on that. How do we tap this market? So it goes back to the investor's choice of what is the risk appetite they want to take. And most of what I have personally seen is that, as we were mentioning, that he's invested in a lot of ICOs last year. So you read about the company, you read about the promoters, and then that's a calculated risk you take. And that's our advice to investors, that you look at the risk appetite, you look at the promoter's credibility and what the intention of this company. Did they follow all the self-regulation documents that should be there in an ICO?
All right. Mo, you want to add something on the utility tokens?
So I think that you're right that utility tokens are a pretty challenging thing to assess, simply because if you look at most startups, it's very difficult to pick a winner. Most good ideas tend to look like bad ideas to start with. And so a utility token can be viewed from that lens. It's very challenging from an investor's standpoint to understand why a utility token should exist. But I would tend towards the examples that of ones that have succeeded. So for example, Ethereum is a very interesting implementation of a utility token. And so for those who don't know what Ethereum is, it's a network similar to Bitcoin in that it's peer-to-peer, but it has a native currency, and this native currency allows you to use the computing resources of the network. And so you buy ethers, and then you can spend ethers to let all the computers in the world run your computer program. And so that's an interesting implementation of a utility token that on face value looked like a very bad idea, but today is actually getting very widespread use. And so when companies are looking at doing an ICO and building a utility token, I would say that it's very easy to do an ICO today. It's very easy to come up with a random idea for a utility token. I would hope that most of them take a deep technological look at what they're doing and make sure that a utility token actually has some basic purpose, as opposed to just an easy way to raise money. But that being said, from a startup perspective, you always have to look at what's best for the business. And sometimes getting easy money might be the right choice. And some of them are doing that. And I hope that they're doing it correctly. But that's not to say that all the people doing utility tokens are in bad faith. It's just very difficult for the outside observer to choose a winner or a loser right now. And so I hope that everybody's very prudent if they're investing in the space.
Completely.
All right. So for startups that are thinking about, let's say, doing an ICO, what would you advise them to do? Where to start?
I think, as it has been said, that they need to be very aware of the risks that they are taking. And also, as a startup, they need to look at the technology is sound, the team that is working with them, the intentions and the jurisdiction from which they launch their ICOs. Because the risk always, if you look at it from the legal perspective, is on there is a jurisdiction that could be friendly today for allowing the ICOs to be launched from there, and tomorrow there could be major changes in the legislation. So that's one of the major risks when they do this SWOT analysis to understand how they launch their whole program. This is one of the key elements that they have to keep it in mind from a very legal perspective. And also when we talk about marketing or promoting of these ICOs to raise the fund, they need to be careful about how is it that they're going and raising these funds. What are the do's and don'ts? What is the KYC they need to do on the investors who are investing in it? And again, we go back to the jurisdiction from where they launch it.
Right. And what is the UAE's position on the ICOs and issuance of tokens? Is that I think Abu Dhabi made a
ADGM.
Yes. ADGM has come up with security-based token ICOs can be launched from ADGM. We also have one of the free zones in Dubai Multi-Commodities Center giving license to cryptocurrency platform exchanges to be registered and regulated by them. We currently, in fact, have a crypto vault operating out of DMCC. So we see UAE being very progressive in their entire approach, not only to cryptocurrencies, but to use the blockchain technology as a way forward.
All right.
You were asking the question, I mean, what would I do as a startup? You have to go back to the basics. You have to think about your business plan. You want to think about your product and your service. Is this viable? Is this going to make it to the market? The fact that you have access to a new tool for funding through an ICO or through crowdfunding does not absolve you from the duty of having a clear idea what's your business plan, who's going to do it, how are you going to market, will it bear the test when it comes to the market? The beauty of crowdfunding or ICOs is that you can have access to investors potentially on a global basis to fund yourself. You still have responsibility towards them to make sure that you're providing them with a product or a service. I think that's what I would say.
You want to add something more?
I'm good.
All right. I think we are almost running out of time. So before asking Q&As, I'll give everybody a chance to a final word about the, as you see, the potential about cryptocurrencies. Your final viewpoint on this, and then we will have a last round of Q&A session.
I'd be happy to get started. So I can say that I've dedicated the past 5 years of my career to the subject, and I don't think that I ever could have imagined we'd be here today or I'd be on a stage talking about it. But that just tends to believe that this is a really big movement. This is a really, really big movement, and I don't think that we can ignore it. And so if you are an investor, an entrepreneur, or anything, I would highly advise you to spend time learning about it, getting involved in one of the communities locally, and really just getting used to the new technology. This is not going to go away. There was a risk of it going away several years ago, but we're past that now. This technology is here to stay, and so you really have to learn to accept it and see how it's going to impact your business.
I strongly believe in the same, that this is a technology that is not the future, but this is happening now. And the more we get into it from today, start as a small investor or small, as we call them, the crypto enthusiast, this is the way forward. And as lawyers, it's an extremely challenging time for us. We're having global discussions on how the regulator, policy papers, and also what we need to revisit our legislations. I come from India, where our legislations are almost 150 years old, so we need to revisit them and bring them to the new technology that we're currently in.
Going back to basics, focus on blockchain. Blockchain is going to be disruptive. Blockchain plus AI is going to, plus artificial intelligence is even going to be more disruptive than it all. When I think of the applications of blockchain, they can be applied to public registers, to company registration, to health, to supply chain, to financial services across the board. Separate that from the issue of cryptocurrency or crypto assets themselves. Those are separate. I would advocate that, particularly for the UAE, we should form a working group for ICOs, for blockchain and AI. Government policy at the federal level is very much in that direction, but you need much more engagement with the private sector and with accelerators and incubators such as Krypto Lab.
Right. Okay, very good. Any questions? Of course.
Oh.
Where's the mic?
I usually attend a lot of those events in Krypto Labs, but I think this is the most event that I have been active at. I don't know why. Maybe it's the engineer in me that was once there has awakened. And hence, I will ask Dr. Nasser about what he mentioned on market manipulation and how Bitcoin market manipulation, cryptocurrency market manipulation, transparency and so forth. And also you mentioned Mountain, Geox, how a trader manipulated the currency, the cryptocurrency. But I'd like to ask you about Mr. George Soros and what he did with the British pound a few decades ago.
That's an easy one. George Soros made 650 million pounds at the end. The reason why he was able to do that, because the Bank of England gave him a one-way bet. So he bet against the Bank of England and he won. But it wasn't market manipulation. It was the fact that the Bank of England wanted to maintain the pound sterling at a given rate. He thought it was going to go down. He made all the bets against it, and yes, he made it. That's how he made 650 million pounds. Okay. However, the Mount Geox business is a different one. It was one single trader that actually was able to manipulate the market. The Bank of England knew exactly what George Soros was doing.
Okay, so you say there is no market manipulation that happens globally in capital markets every day?
No, I'm saying that central banks can make big mistakes.
Mo is happy.
Central banks can make big mistakes. If you maintain exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate, at the wrong rate, you're inviting a lot of speculation against that.
Okay, you mentioned, sorry, maybe I'm taking the opportunity from others, but again, this is a very interesting discussion. You mentioned also the forks in Bitcoin, how they wanted to have 21 million coins, and then once upon a time they decided maybe they'll have a fork, etc., etc. But sounds like the Fed also keeps printing money without really, a limit. Don't you think it's the same? US dollar, there is no limit to printing US dollars also, right?
Based on the debt.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the forks because for me as an economist, the forks are really close to debasing the currency. And yes, we live in a world in which we all have fiat currencies, that is, they're worthless pieces of paper issued by governments which say this is $1 or this is 1 rial or 1 dirham. It's fiat currencies. There's nothing behind that. There's no gold, there's no silver, there's no nothing. That is true. The difference, however, is that at the end of the day, the central banks, like the Fed, like the central banks elsewhere, are under the political authority of the sovereign. And it is that institution, plus the political authority of the sovereign, which puts a limit on how much currency and how much money creation takes place. With Bitcoin, we were promised at the beginning that there would be a total 21 million, not so?
Yes.
That would be the total 21 million. Once I start having a fork, and I have Bitcoin, and I have Bitcoin Cash, and I have Bitcoin Gold, then you have effectively debased Bitcoin. I no longer know what the limit is going to be. Maybe the limit is how much energy I use, and in which case I would want to tax it.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So one last question
I think there's
to
more.
Mo. One last question to Mo. So Mo, you keep talking about how great cryptocurrencies are, and you spent the past 5 years of your life on this journey. Now you basically are depending on a technology, blockchain technology, which might in the near future or the far future all of a sudden be disrupted by another technology. Don't you think that it's unfair also for all the Bitcoin buyers and traders and those who have mined a lot of Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies and spent a lot of resources, as Dr. Nasser says, the size of Singapore Energy or Ireland Energy, and then all of a sudden comes a technology which makes blockchain technology an archaic technology, and there goes the $614 billion of cryptocurrency assets? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought of it in that way. I guess I would say we used to have a gold standard and then the US dollar arose. I don't know if the people issuing the US dollar really feared for the old gold holders, oh my God, what will happen to all these people who owned gold? There's this new paper money that's replacing it. I guess as a technologist, I'm excited for innovation. If Bitcoin does end up being a failed experiment, then we should learn it as soon as possible. But until then, it's the best thing we've got, and we should continue to innovate on it. This is a free market technology. There's nobody mandating anybody to buy Bitcoin, to use blockchain. You engage with it as much as you choose. And so you should know the risks. There is a very big risk that this could go nowhere. But right now it's on a very positive trend. And I would say that another thing to keep in mind is that no great idea is obviously a great idea. Most good ideas tend to be quite polarizing and might not look like a good idea to start, but they end up being very interesting. And so I think that Bitcoin is in that space right now. There's a chance that something will come and replace it, and I encourage the person developing that to build it today. Let's do it. Let's get rid of Bitcoin if you can, but it's going to be pretty challenging because we built something pretty powerful so far.
Right, please.
Yes. Hello, thanks for the discussion. So basically, as someone working in finance, I care about the value of Bitcoin at the end of the day, to know if I buy or I sell the Bitcoin. I totally agree with what Dr. Nasser said about the fact that we saw kind of a squeeze in the Bitcoin space. If we look at the futures contract, and now it's exchange traded, cleared by the CFTC, everyone can see each trade, what's happening in each trade. We saw the transaction, every transaction on Bitcoin is 1 or 2 contracts maximum. So still, till today, we see that there are few number of players controlling the market. So if we relate this, or, and my question especially for Dr. Nasser, if we compare this to the commodities, because at the end of the day, it can be compared to a commodity. We saw a squeeze in the silver market in the 90s or the 80s, we saw a squeeze in the cotton market, in the cocoa market, and we saw jumps in the prices even higher than the Bitcoin. After the squeeze, or after the bubble, if I can call it a bubble, we saw a correction and the commodity goes back to its marginal cost of production. The marginal cost of production in Bitcoin is roughly around $1,500 to $2,000. Do you think Bitcoin can go to this price if these number of players, start to sell the Bitcoin?
I think you're right. You're right to compare it to more to a commodity, than to a currency. Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I call it more a crypto asset than otherwise.
And it can be compared
There
to a commodity more.
There is, however, a difference. If you look at gold, or you look at cocoa, or you look at silver, or anything else, at the end of the day, there is an industrial use. And we also have an idea about the cost of production. Gold mining, silver mining, we know all that. And at the end of the day, you can always use that. That is not the case for Bitcoin. What would I do with it? It's purely virtual. It's a virtual currency at the end of the day. So its value at the end of the day is how much people are willing to pay for it. Because it's nobody's liability. I come back to the main issue. This is nobody's liability. So in answer to your question, yes, it can crash, and it can go much below what we see today, and it can also go way up. Would you want to invest in it? I don't know.
But the cost of production is roughly, there is a study roughly because of electricity prices, is roughly around $1,500 to $2,000. Marginal cost of production.
Yes, if you continue allowing them access to cheap electricity.
But isn't this like gold? Because most of the gold that is bought is not used.
Isn't it like gold?
Yeah. So most of the gold that is bought,
Yes.
you said industrial use, etc., etc. Yes.
Sure.
They use them sometimes in industries. Diamond is also used in certain industries, to drill oil. But most of the gold, and even diamonds, I think most of the
Sure.
gold is not used, in the industry. So to me, it's very similar to Bitcoin.
Yes.
Except that it's hard, other one's virtual, but
that's-
also my money in the bank account is very
There's a-
virtual.
There's a legacy issue with respect to gold, right? Because it used to be part of reserves of central banks.
True.
And we continue to think at the end of the day that there's some value, intrinsic value to gold. There is no intrinsic value to gold except for its industrial use. And the fact that we as human animals like to have gold stuff and silver stuff, which we hang around our necks and we put in our watches and all the rest. So that is maybe human nature, and it may very well be true that what's happening with Bitcoin is also really just animal spirits and human nature.
See, I think in terms of nature, I think in the future, if you see the behavior of generations or every 10 years, swiping, being virtual, just for the sake of being virtual, is a trend that is coming. So if you look, for example, at hotels.com or hotels booking, that industry, the winner was a company that was in that space at the right time. So they did not do anything special. All they did was they were at the right time when many people preferred to be booking virtually simply because Apple made it, the internet was there, etc., etc., etc. So I think if I have to just predict the future, there will be a lot of use. The behavior of the new generation will be very different. So I think there will be a push towards some kind of blockchain or some kind of cryptocurrency, but how much and what, I don't know. But so this is speculation. This is just from my side. But that's not my question. I don't want to speculate at all, and I want to live today, in today's world. So in the future, we know maybe there is no currency that will live. Maybe still we are in the fiat world. But knowing what we know today, so there is kind of a war between, let's say, government agencies or entrepreneurs versus governments. So you have all these new products coming in, governments trying to understand it. How or what are the, let's say, 4 or 5 things that needs to be done such that a currency, you have a winner over there? يعني, all of the issues that you mentioned, what are the 3 or the 4 things that an entrepreneur or someone who wants to be in that space can do so that it makes his chances of winning high?
I think you will have digital currencies, but I think they will be issued by sovereign governments, because a digital economy needs something like a digital currency. I think you need that. But people will also want the trust of an institution, and the only way you can get the trust of an institution is, in today's world, which is a world of sovereign nations, is to have a sovereign saying, I stand behind this digital currency. So I think you're going to be heading that way. If you didn't have sovereign states, then you might have one digital currency for the whole world. And the vision behind cryptocurrencies initially was to say, I live in a practically a virtual world where I do things on the internet, etc. And then I would have basically one single currency. We don't have that world at the moment. Maybe sometime in the future we might. If I want to think about what we should be doing, say, in the UAE today, I would say form a working group between people on the tech side, on the legal side, sit down with the central bank, with AGGM, and with the DIFC, and say, how does the UAE issue a digital currency that can be used? And you also need to think of, how do I protect that? Because we have no laws on digital assets. Look at the situation today. Let's suppose you've invested a lot in digital assets of their many types. And then, as will happen, you die. You don't know where those digital assets are, who holds them, and how your family, your sons and daughters and your wife, etc., will be able to get hold of those digital assets. We buy all sorts of things today, but I have no protection for my digital assets and how they will preserve value from generation to generation. I think this is the sort of thing that concerns us, that should concern us.
Sorry, if I may add. Sorry. So,
is it the engineer or the banker now?
Now it's going to be the engineer again. So you talk about trust and how sovereigns and central banks have the trust that people need. But we forget, and Mo can step in here, we forget that Bitcoin started, or cryptocurrencies started, because of the lack of trust in the financial system, number one. And number two, cryptocurrencies are built on the fact that they are very trustworthy, such that you cannot be printing unlimited currency like some central banks. Very hard to hack, although there might be some incidents. And maybe this is controversial, but the reason why Bitcoin started, as Jean-Luc have showed us, was because of lack of trust in the financial system, which unfortunately, if we go back to 2008, the ones that have lost money and were disadvantaged were the ones who are on the poorer side of the scale, and the standard of living has became more polarized with time since 2008 till today, and that's why perhaps people have looked at cryptocurrencies as a way to bypass the central banks and financial markets and regulators that existed in 2008. So, what do you think about that?
Can I answer this one? I really like this question. And I think it tends towards the global question of sovereignty. Dr. Nasser's postulation is that people trust the central government and they trust the money of the central government. But I think that we should remember that government isn't classically good at writing software. I don't know if many of us use government software that's better than Snapchat or is better than Facebook or any other startup software. And so I think that we should remember that if a government issues a cryptocurrency, it likely won't be better than what the free market will produce. It might, but it likely won't if we look at the historical precedent. And the second thing I would say is, I think that at least in North America, people probably trust Google more than they trust their own governments right now. And never have we seen private money as an option. And so if Google were to issue its own currency, I would say that a lot of people would trust it, maybe more than they trust their own government. And so it's going to be a competition, and I don't know if it's a great bet to bet on the government's ability to produce good software. If that's what the central government currency's postulation is. And so let's not forget that startups are good at writing software, and they're going to be competing against the government here directly.
Last question.
Thank you. I wanted to ask this question in the previous session regarding ICO regulations. We've seen recently, since January, Malta being very tolerant with ICOs, and we've heard that there are big companies like Binance and Tron, they're moving to Malta. Do you believe that Malta will be the future Silicon Valley of cryptocurrency? And my second question is, since the beginning of this discussion, we've been discussing cryptocurrency, Bitcoin and ICOs. We didn't discuss the altcoins in between. I mean, cryptocurrency is very disruptive. I believe that it's the most disruptive technology after the internet. And actually, these altcoins, they complete each other. I mean, Litecoin completes Bitcoin, Ethereum has smart contracts, we have Ripple with no mining, which solves the environmental problem. We have Tron for microtransactions. I mean, the possibilities are endless with this, and they should coexist together. There is no one major cryptocurrency in the end. And this is the beauty of it, in my opinion. And my other question is, it's maybe a bit, what do you think about ICOs that are backed up? We've been hearing about ICOs that are backed up by oil, that are backed up by gold. How are they audited? How are the values fixed in this? And I don't know if this is a legal or a financial question.
So the ICOs which are based on oil or gold are the ICOs typically which we call the security-backed ICOs. So the volatility in those is very limited because there is an asset that has performed for a very long time. People are aware of it, the regulators and the legislations have worked on it. So those assets are what we call safe investments. So these are the ones which will depend on not on how the promoters perform, but actually the asset on which they are based on performs. So the governments and the legislations are first trying to regulate those and having those registered. So I personally believe in it. There is no formal say on it, but I personally believe in it that those will be for the long-term investments, long-term stay in the market than utility tokens.
But do our current, like the big four auditors, do they have the experience to audit these ICOs, seeing that?
So it's a new technology. So when we have the new, so when we have the new technology and the new apps working on it, that's where the auditors are getting trained. That is where the legislators, the lawyers, the professionals attached with that system. Something as unique as we had a client who has invested in Bitcoins, and he came to us for his estate planning to understand that how does he go about giving it to his legal heirs? What does he call it? Will he call it investments? So these are the challenging times in which the training and discussions, and as you said, that we need to have a proper working group working with the government, looking at all aspects. When we talk about a transition that is happening in an economy, we cannot leave any sector. So all sectors have to work on it together, collectively, to come up with the proper framework for it.
All right, we have to wrap up here. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for our panel.
Thank you for a wonderful session. And actually, I wanted to say thank you for a very competitive session. And thank you for competitive spirit. In Arabic, thank you for the الأخلاق الرياضية. I think there was a lot of, let's say, two sides of the spectrum were here. One very pro and one that's very not pro. And then the third was a lot of advice here and there. So again, thank you for coming. We'll have a lot of these sessions and we will consider the work group, we'll consider it in the close future. Thanks a lot again for everyone for coming and there is more to come. Thank you.